picture this, a seemingly ordinary apartment building in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but behind one of those doors
Oh, yeah.
lies a scene straight out of a nightmare. A man brutally murdered his birthday dinner. Date left waiting,
Yeah.
and years later the case remains unsolved. Today we're diving deep into the mysteries surrounding the death of Timothy Zimmerman.
You know what's particularly chilling about this case is the setting itself, a place that should feel safe, a familiar apartment building,
Right.
becomes the backdrop for a violent crime. It's a stark reminder that darkness can truly lurk anywhere.
You really can. It was April 12th, 2007, Tim's birthday. He was a well-loved landlord and realtor, a man who knew his properties like the back of his hand.
Mm-hmm.
He had an appointment to show a vacant unit at the fourplex, one of his buildings, but he never made it to his birthday dinner with his girlfriend, Cynthia.
And that detail, the missed birthday dinner,
Yeah.
that's what elevates this from a simple missing person case to something far more sinister.
Yeah.
It speaks to a sudden, unexpected interruption.
Absolutely heartbreaking. Tim's brother Jim grew increasingly worried when Tim didn't answer his calls.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't like Tim to just disappear, especially on his birthday. Then a tenant at the fourplex called Jim, saying the police were there, asking about Tim.
Oh my gosh, that phone call from the tenant
I know.
must have been terrifying.
Yeah.
It's the moment the situation shifts from concern to genuine fear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It turns out Cynthia had reported Tim missing either earlier that day or the night before.
Okay.
The details are a bit murky there.
Yeah.
But she told police she was worried because Tim missing their plans was unusual.
The timing of that missing person report is
Okay.
definitely something to consider. Was there a delay in reporting? And if
Yeah.
so, why could that have impacted the early stages of the investigation?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
Now picture Jim arriving at the fourplex,
Okay.
letting the police into that vacant apartment, and the horror of finding his own brother's body.
The police reports describe a scene of sheer brutality.
Oh, wow.
Blood everywhere, indicating a fierce struggle, a desperate fight for life. Tim had been stabbed multiple times with defensive wounds on his hands and arms.
It's hard to even imagine the level of violence that took place in that apartment. And to make matters worse, none of the tenants reported hearing anything.
That silence is incredibly eerie, don't you think?
Yeah.
Either the attack was somehow muffled, which seems unlikely given the blood evidence,
Right.
or whoever committed this crime knew the building's routines well enough to ensure they wouldn't be heard.
It's chilling to think about. Now, at the crime scene, there were a few things that stood out right away. Alongside Tim's body, they found a bloody shoe print, a size 12 Nike.
That shoe print becomes a critical piece of evidence. It's
Yeah.
a direct link to the perpetrator,
Right.
a physical trace left behind in the chaos of the attack.
But then there are the other details. Tim's glasses were neatly placed on a table, along with an ink pen and a blank rental agreement. It's almost as if he was preparing for the meeting and then...
It's almost staged, isn't it?
Right.
It raises the question, was Tim caught off guard?
Right.
Or was there a level of premeditation involved, a carefully constructed scenario?
So many questions. Police naturally started looking at people connected to Tim. Their initial focus was a tenant who had been feuding with Tim over late rent and some alleged drug activity. A classic starting point in these cases.
Focusing on those immediate connections is crucial in the early stages of an investigation.
Yeah.
But it's equally important to keep an open mind to consider other possibilities as the case unfolds.
You're right, and as you'll see, this case takes some unexpected turns. Remember those hang-up calls Cynthia was getting on the day Tim disappeared?
Yeah.
Well, those seemingly insignificant calls might hold a bigger clue than anyone initially realized.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Those hang-up calls, especially back in 2007, before caller ID was as common as it is today,
Right.
they really suggest a deliberate attempt to intimidate or maybe even monitor Cynthia's movements.
It's like whoever was making those calls wanted to know her whereabouts without revealing their own identity.
It's a chilling thought.
Exactly. And as investigators dug deeper, their attention turned towards a figure much closer to home, Cynthia's son, Destin.
Destin had a bit of a history with Tim. There were reports of conflict between them, disagreements that sometimes escalated into pretty heated arguments.
Right, and those conflicts, even if they seemed minor at the time,
Yeah.
they can become incredibly significant in a homicide investigation.
Absolutely.
They provide potential motives, points of friction that could escalate under the right circumstances.
And the more investigators looked into Destin, the more suspicious things became. Jim. Tim's brother remembered seeing scratches on Destin's face the night Tim's body was found.
Those scratches, which Destin just kind of brushed off as from a slap fight,
Yeah.
they take on a whole new meaning when you consider the violent nature of Tim's death.
Right.
Could those scratches have been inflicted during the struggle? Defensive wounds, perhaps?
It's certainly a possibility. And remember that size 12 Nike shoe print found at the crime scene?
Oh, yeah.
Well, Jim mentioned that Destin wore that same size shoe. The shoe print alone doesn't definitively point to Destin, of course,
Right.
but it's another piece of circumstantial evidence that starts to build a case.
And then there's the testimony from another tenant who claimed to have seen Destin trying to get into the sealed-off crime scene later that night.
That's a bold move.
Yeah.
Even if he was just curious, it definitely raises eyebrows.
Right.
Why would he feel the need to get close to the crime scene, especially after his mother's boyfriend had been found murdered there?
Exactly. And then we have the DNA evidence. Police found a male DNA profile on one of Tim's socks, and it matched Destin.
This is where the science of DNA analysis gets fascinating.
Yeah.
While DNA match is strong evidence, it's crucial to understand the context.
Right.
We need to ask, what type of DNA was it? Was it blood, or could it have been touched DNA? Could there have been innocent transfer, especially given that Destin had previously lived in the same house as Tim?
Those are all crucial questions. And unfortunately, the answers are more complicated than a simple yes or no.
Precisely. Contamination is always a possibility in these cases. And without knowing the specific type of biological material that produced the DNA profile, it's difficult to say with absolute certainty how incriminating it truly is.
So we have a web of circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
The scratches, the shoe print, the DNA, the suspicious behavior, and then 3 years after Tim's murder, Destin dies in a motorcycle accident.
A tragic event, no doubt.
Yeah.
But from an investigative standpoint, it's a devastating blow to the case.
Right.
If Destin did indeed kill Tim, he took those answers with him to the grave.
Feels like a cruel twist of fate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Just when investigators were zeroing in on Destin, the possibility of getting concrete answers slipped away.
It highlights the importance of timely investigations, of pursuing leads while witnesses are available and memories are fresh.
But even with Destin gone, the case wasn't entirely closed. Years later, in 2015, a glimmer of hope emerged from an unexpected source. Police received a tip about potential evidence hidden in the attic of the fourplex.
This tip, years after the crime, must have been both intriguing and frustrating for investigators. The attic had never been searched back in 2007.
Right.
So the possibility of finding new evidence was tantalizing.
The tipster claimed that bloody clothes belonging to the perpetrator were hidden up there. Armed with a warrant, police searched the attic, and they did find clothes with suspicious stains.
It must have felt like they were on the verge of a major breakthrough.
Right.
After all these years, could this be the missing piece of the puzzle?
Unfortunately, lab testing revealed that the stains weren't blood. Another dead end.
It's a recurring theme in this case, isn't it?
It is.
A promising lead that ultimately leads to disappointment. It's enough to make anyone wonder if this case is destined to remain unsolved.
With Destin gone, Cynthia gone, and Destin's sibling also deceased, investigators are left with very few options.
The passage of time is a double-edged sword in these cases. While it allows for perspective and sometimes new technologies to emerge, it also makes gathering reliable evidence and witness testimony incredibly challenging.
But Detective Martin, who has dedicated years to this case, isn't giving up. He's still hoping that someone out there knows something that could help bring justice for Tim.
Sometimes it's the smallest detail that can crack a case wide open. Perhaps someone remembers seeing something unusual around the time of the murder, something they dismissed as insignificant back then.
Right.
Or maybe someone knows who that prospective tenant Tim was supposed to meet.
That detail, the missing tenant, has always been a nagging loose end in this case. If we could just identify that person, it could potentially unlock the entire mystery. You know, it's a puzzle with so many missing pieces.
Yeah.
But even without all the answers, we can still learn something from Tim's story. This case really underscores the profound impact unsolved crimes have, not just on the victims, but on their families and communities as well.
It's like a ripple effect.
Right.
The violence at the center, creates waves of grief and unanswered questions and a lingering sense of injustice that can last for years.
Tim's family deserves closure, and hopefully one day they'll get it. But as we've seen in this deep dive, the passage of time can make that increasingly difficult.
It's a race against time in many ways. Memories fade, witnesses become unavailable, and physical evidence can deteriorate.
Which is why it's so important for anyone with even the smallest bit of information to come forward.
Right.
Maybe someone saw something unusual near the fourplex that day. Or perhaps they heard a rumor that seemed insignificant at the time.
Yeah.
Even the tiniest detail could be the missing link.
Sometimes it's those seemingly insignificant details that hold the key.
Yeah.
A casual observation, an overheard conversation, something dismissed as gossip,
Right.
could be the breakthrough investigators need.
If you have any information about the murder of Timothy Zimmerman, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, please contact Fort Wayne Crime Stoppers at 260-436-SFP.
Right.
You can remain completely anonymous.
That's 260-436-7867. Every tip, every piece of information brings us one step closer to solving this case and providing some measure of justice for Tim and his family.
As we wrap up our deep dive into this case, I'm left with a mix of sadness and frustration. A life was senselessly taken, and so many questions remain unanswered.
It's a stark reminder that even in seemingly ordinary places, darkness can find a foothold, and the quest for justice can be long and arduous.
But Tim's story also serves as a reminder that we can't give up hope. Someone out there might hold the key to solving this mystery, and maybe, just maybe, by keeping Tim's memory alive and encouraging people to come forward, we can help bring closure to this heartbreaking case.